Hello, everybody. Welcome, welcome. Join the chat, say hello. I am Ryan Starr. I'm an instructor in Manhattan Prep and have been for a long time. I've been in the GMAT game much longer still. And I took the GMAT Focus on opening day, November 7th, and lived to tell the tale, allegedly. So hopefully I'll be able to shed some light from my experience on this whole thing as we're talking about it. What I really want to talk about, of course, is just what's in the data insights section. How is it the same as IR? How is it different from IR? Things like that. Okay, so we'll start with a bit of an overview. I trust that a lot of you will be familiar with the basic question types in IR, tables, graphs, and so on. So I'm going to go into a bit more detail about the kinds of table questions you might expect to see, the kinds of graph questions you might expect to see, and so on. Also going to talk about the different kinds of data sufficiency that are on the new data insights section, because data sufficiency has been tweaked a little bit. All right. So all of that is coming our way. Again, use the chat window, say hello as Ajay did, and ask questions all throughout. You guys are more than welcome to, and in fact, encouraged to. Okay. So, data insights section is a bit hard to pin down right now. There's a lot of variability in how many of each question type you'll have. However, the typical expectation would be about 8 data sufficiency questions. And then 2 to 4 is about right for all of these question types. You probably get about 4 two-parts. You probably get about 3 MSRs, about 3 graphs, about 2 tables. It's changeable from test to test. That's about the way it goes. Now, the MSR can also have tables and graphs on it, as it always could. And really, much of the IR portion of the data insights section, the part that's kind of like subsumed the former IR section, is relatively unchanged. There's, not really new question types or even really new question subtypes to speak of there. They have definitely done some things to make it a bit more challenging than it was before. And so that's something that's kind of new. IR used to be non-adaptive, pretty straightforward. Data insights, though, different story. All right. Excellent. Seeing more of you in the chat window. That is what I love to see. Now, first thing, time management. And I'm coming at this time management thing from a very honest place. Like, I ran out of time on my data insights section. That definitely happened. I run pretty tight on time in the IR section. Data insights was even harder because typically on the old quant sections, I used to spend more time on data sufficiency than on problem solving. So while the new quant section is very fast for me, the new data insights section is kind of like the worst of both worlds for me, and it made it really, really hard to finish on time. So how do you manage time? This is going to depend somewhat on whether you're taking the test in person or from home. But essentially, you can keep track of your time using something that we call the yellow pad technique. We have used it for quant for a long time, and now just adapting it to the IR section. Essentially, it goes like this. If you're in the test center, you get a pad of laminated paper. It's not usually yellow anymore. It's usually white or cream colored, but it's about like this. The first page will have some writing on it with test center information, and then all the other pages will be fairly blank, should be graph paper usually, or grid paper. All right. What you can do to keep track of your timing is basically do 4 questions on every page. Bracket it out, each page that is, into quadrants, and count down by 8 minutes with each successive page. If the average question in Data Insights is supposed to take you about 2 minutes, which is a bit faster than the old IR section was, so that one clocked in at about 2.5 minutes per question. So if this new Data Insights section is supposed to take you just over 2 minutes per question, safer to give each page of 4 questions 8 minutes. You start with 42 minutes, so at the bottom of the first page, write 34 minutes. That's what you'd expect to have left over at the end of those 4 questions. Get through those 4 questions, look at the time remaining in the test in the upper right corner of the screen, and if you have something other than 34 minutes remaining, you know what you need to do. So like, let's say you look at the time in the upper right corner of the screen and you have 36 minutes remaining. Good. Well done. Better person than I am. In that case, you know that you can afford to slow down a little bit in the next set of four. Maybe take a flyer on one of the questions that you might not ordinarily do, but that you have the time now to commit to and maybe get something good coming out of it, or you have the time to double check. Essentially, you don't want to be ahead of time throughout the section too much, because if you're ahead of time, you're probably squandering opportunities to be a bit more careful, a bit more thorough, and avoid some careless mistakes. And while we call them careless mistakes, the truth is a lot of the mistakes in data insights are going to be programmed careless mistakes. They deliberately give things similar names to other things so that you'll look in the wrong place. They deliberately ask the questions in a not straightforward way. Okay, so it does behoove you to have some time to double check your questions and things like that. Meaning, if you're ahead of time, slow down. But for most people, again, myself included, behind time is the bigger issue, right? Maybe you finish these four questions, you look at the clock and you only have 30 minutes left. You really let yourself go on those four, took 4 extra minutes. That's fine too. All that means to you is in the next set of 4 questions, you want to think about skipping one. All right. Now, which one do you skip? That depends a lot on historic performance. All right. So you can either try to get a read problem by problem in those next 4 on which one seems quite hard. And remember, now that the GMAT Focus Edition is a thing, even if you temporarily skip a problem or put in a random answer for it and just move on from there, you can return to that problem later up to 3 times per section, right? So you can return to up to 3 problems per section, which means sometimes it is in your interest to just let go of a problem when you first see it because it looks like it's going to be time consuming. You're already behind on time, let's say. Let go of it. Put in a random answer. Say, I'm not going to give you any time right now. If I happen to have time left over at the end of the section, I'll come back to you, friend, and move on, all right? The point of keeping track of your time every 4 questions or so is that you can course correct before it gets too out of hand, right? If you do look at the clock here and it's 30 minutes left, that's not ideal. Like 4 minutes behind, you're kind of 2 questions behind there. But still better that you know about it here than that you get all the way to question like 12 before you check in and see that you have 3 minutes left, right? It can come apart on you pretty quickly like that. So manage your time in groups of 4. If you're especially doing it in a test center, just break the pad into quadrants like this and go for it. You'll still have a few pages of scratch paper left over. You might be able after this to just exchange your scratch pad out with the proctor. They might make you keep it until you fill it up. And that might well determine your section order for the exam, because in all likelihood, you'll want to do a similar thing for the quant section, only the quant section will take, well, it'll take about the same, about 5 pages, and you won't have 5 pages left necessarily if you've done this for data insights already. And so at some point, you're probably going to want to switch the scratch paper over. And that means, in truth, you might want to separate data insights and quant by a section, like put verbal in between them, so that whichever one you do first, you've got room to finish up that scratch pad with verbal, take your break then, ask for a new scratch pad, and you don't have to be interrupted while you're doing it. All right. That is the one kind of thing to keep in mind if you're going to use this technique. It does take a lot of scratch paper. You might not use all these quadrants for serious scratch work as you're doing the data insight section. And so a lot of your scratch paper is gone for not necessarily a huge amount of benefit. You can always ask for more. But if you engineer it right, you'll ask for more in a way that doesn't interfere with your ability to finish the test. If you are taking the test from home or online, you do not have a scratch pad, you're not allowed to use anything remotely resembling paper. You're allowed to use a whiteboard, as I'm sure a lot of you guys know, no bigger than 12 by 20 inches. But you also have access to an on-screen whiteboard. That looks a bit like this. It has kind of old MS Paint functionality, and it can stay persistently on the screen, or it can be hidden at any point that you really want to hide it. And so you can use this as kind of a static time tracker as well, as opposed to trying to use your whiteboard for tracking time, which you can do, but you'll have to dedicate like a whole strip of your whiteboard to it. That takes away from some of your scratch work surface. And if you can live with that, cool, do it on your whiteboard, dedicate aside to just keeping track of your time and guidelines. However, this is an actually good use of the online whiteboard. And as most people will tell you, there aren't a lot of good uses for the online whiteboard. All right. Keeping track of your time, just having it kind of persistently there so you can check off questions as you do them. You don't want to actually like do the scratch work on this online whiteboard because it's not great. But you can absolutely keep track of your time here in a way that doesn't interfere too much with your ability to do the questions, just keeps you on track essentially. Again, I find this necessary, like nowhere do I find this more necessary than in the data insights section. The time is hard there. I know some people breeze through it, but for a lot of people, timing is tightest in the data insights section. And so you really do want to go into it with a time management strategy that you've practiced and so can rely upon on test day. Okay. Yeah, and please do, as Abhijit said in the chat window, please share your questions and doubts. I will be able to tell you so much more than you might expect because I have no problem making up stuff. Okay. Indeed. So first we're going to talk data sufficiency. For anybody who's been studying for the GMAT for a while, data sufficiency has been there since times immemorial, right? But this is the first significant change to data sufficiency in a good long time. The only other real change I've seen in the last 20 or so years to data sufficiency is that they've started leaning away from data sufficiency questions in which you get sufficient with an answer of no. Still possible, but they don't do a lot of that anymore. This data sufficiency is different. So they still have some classic kind of math-based data sufficiency questions. In fact, a lot of my questions in my data insights section, a lot of my data sufficiency questions were math-based. They were, in particular, statistics-based. Lot of questions about sets, averages, medians, and all things statistics in my data sufficiency questions. In fact, as far as I remember, that's about all I got in my data sufficiency questions, just a ton of statistics. I know that there were other question types in there, but that is very much what it felt like at the time. However, and so, by the way, on screen right now, a kind of classic data sufficiency look. I'm assuming, again, because you're here, you've probably seen data sufficiency before, but in case you haven't, the quick rundown is you're always given a question up top that doesn't immediately have an answer. Like it's an unanswerable question. They haven't given you data to really answer it. And then you're going to get these two things down here, statements 1 and 2. Those two things are your kind of clues to answering the question. They're pieces of information, and you're trying to determine, are these pieces of information enough to enable me to get a single answer to that question up there? This one on screen is a really classic example of a like mathy data sufficiency question. And you can see, of course, that there's still logic involved in it, right? So like you need to know how many of the employees in attendance are senior managers. First statement tells you 80% were senior managers, but that's not how many, right? 80% of like 10 attendees would be a different how many than 80% of 100 attendees at this conference, right? And so we're left a little bit lacking. Similarly, in statement 2, we've got an actual count here, 64, but this is 64 who were not senior managers, and the question's asking how many were senior managers. So it's a count, but of the wrong thing. However, when you combine these two statements, this is where the logic comes in. The logic you have to see, of course, is that you're either a senior manager or not a senior manager. As far as the GMAT is concerned, everything in the known universe is either a senior manager or not a senior manager. So when you see these two phrases, senior managers, not senior managers, what you've got is a mutually exclusive, collectively exhaustive set. All right, 100% of the things. Meaning if 80% were senior managers, 20% were not senior managers, and if the 20% of attendees who were not senior managers is equivalent to 64, you can use that to figure out what 80% would be equivalent to. So it's a math question, but it's a logic question, and this is what it's basically always been. Some of the data sufficiency questions lean more heavily into the math side, some lean more heavily into the logic side. What's new in data sufficiency on the data insights section is they found new ways to lean into the logic more than they ever did before. Okay, so this is a good example of the new kind of data sufficiency question you are likely to see in a data insights section. Could be a lot of your questions play out like this, could be very few of your questions play out like this. For my part, I had very few questions in the data insights play out like this, even though I was kind of anticipating some of these questions. Notice the difference. There's not a lot of math here, right? No like percentages, no numbers, no calculations really to do. Just times and some information, very real world information, right? That is to say, data sufficiency is sometimes now leaning entirely into logic. All right. Take a minute with this one. See if you can come up with an answer. And you don't have to tell me in the chat window if you don't want to. If you want to check your answer, just put yourself out there. By all means do. And an answer to your question, Kamal, with quant, you definitely can because it's 2 minutes per question, pretty flat. Verbal, a little bit less so for a couple of reasons. One, the timing is not exactly 2 minutes per question. It's a little bit less. And two, you never really know where the reading comprehension passages are going to come, and those take longer, generally speaking, or they can at least take longer than the critical reasoning questions. And so in verbal, the times kind of come in like weird chunks as opposed to a nice kind of even distribution of 2 minutes per question throughout, on average. Hey, Pooja. That's a great question. There's not a huge difference between the IR section in the classic mode and the IR type questions in the data insight section. Probably the biggest difference is the fact that they can get a bit harder now. You don't have just kind of a fixed section being thrown at you, but rather more of an adaptive thing going on. Other than that, though, there's not a huge amount of difference. I'm actually looking at my data insights performance now because the GMAT gives you much kind of better analytics after you take the test than it used to, regardless of whether you take it online or in a test center, and you don't have to pay extra for it the way you used to for the enhanced score report, the ESR. I'll share this with you guys later, but essentially, like, it's a lot of the same sort of questions. I got plenty of two parts, plenty of they group graph and table questions together, so plenty of graph and table questions together. I do remember that actually like the hardest question on my data insight section was a graph question. But what made it hard was not something totally new, not something that wouldn't have been on the IR section before. It was just a really difficult instance of it. So the thing that I noticed basically about IR that differentiated it from previous IR section is just that the questions seemed to get significantly harder toward the end of this data insight section than the IR questions really ever got. But in terms of the like kinds of questions and things like that, not very different, just maybe a bit more complicated for the questions that are in the harder bracket. Nice. C's and A's, both great answers. If I could, I would make them both right. And I can. I do have that power. I'm a GMAT expert. You're safe with me. No, just kidding. All right, let's dig into it a little bit. Okay, before we get into Pooja's question, do I think course curriculum of a focus edition, of like taking a focus edition course would be beneficial in acing the MBA course curriculum? Not really, except in the sense that if it's been a while since you've done math, the math that you relearn with a course like a focus edition course can be helpful in an MBA program. But beyond that, honestly, not a huge amount. The GMAT has always been kind of an abstract test testing certain skills that are meant to be correlated with good performance in business school. But in terms of the actual content, there's never been, and there still isn't, a huge amount of overlap, sadly. Cody, you are right in this case. And so I don't think, Sai might have copied you, but I think Sai's just equally right. Don't copy them because that's cheating. Now you know they're right. Just let them have it. This one looks like it's going to be C. And as anybody who's studied data sufficiency for a while knows, C is the answer you trust the least. When it looks like it's going to be C, especially if you get there fairly easily, and I'm not saying it's easy to get to C in this case, but just in general, if you feel like you can easily pick C in data sufficiency, take a beat and see if you can do it with a little bit less. Yeah, Sai, totally right. Um, Unless she starts with a break, it has to be A. And I think, what do they say about breaks? They put breaks between each meeting, essentially, right? So not before or after, only between is what we know from this. And that is a really good caveat because that's the sort of thing you want to think about and then double check and make sure the problem's like addressed in some way. If they hadn't addressed that, different story, right? Then it actually makes a difference. Okay, so why does it end up being A and not C? Certainly C works. If A works on its own, then when you put the two statements together, they definitely work together. That's always been the case. That's why C's text is as long as it is, because they want to make it really clear that C means they only work together, they won't work on their own. All right. We get these rules up here, and that's exactly what you want to think of them as, rules. So IR's always had certain logic type questions. A logic type two-part question is pretty common on any given IR section. A logic type table or graph question can also be seen on a lot of IR sections. Now we've got logic-based data sufficiency. They give you rules, and the trick is to either draw out, diagram out, note down the rules that apply, right? So we know the meetings are hour-long meetings, and we know there are 3 of them scheduled. One with Fatima, one with Natasha, one with Seth, right? And we've got 3.5 hours for scheduling these meetings, right? Which makes sense because we're going to need at least 3 hours for these meetings. It's not clear yet why the extra half hour is available to us, but once we get to the following sentence, Cassie also put a 15-minute break between each meeting. Now we know why that extra half hour is there. And that's another way that you know, Sai, that of course there can't be a break also at the beginning because you have to have 15 minutes between each meeting. That's already half an hour between the like first and second meeting and second and third meeting, and the 3 meetings themselves are already 3 hours, and that's your whole time window taken up. All right, anytime a problem seems kind of ambiguous like that on a certain count, like look to the information one more time with that question in mind, and you'll find there are ways to clear up the ambiguity. So if each meeting started and ended on time, again, just a caveat there to let you know there are no shenanigans. It's not like the Fatima meeting only went 40 minutes or anything like that. It's not like the break went long. Did Cassie meet with Fatima last? Okay, and of course it's stated sufficiency. You can't answer that just yet because you just have some general rules on how this thing's set up. Now, there is a tendency. So let's say you picked C and you picked it fairly quickly and you're thinking, all right, definitely with these 2 pieces of information, it's enough. I could get this. I said before that you want to be a little wary of an easy C. You want to vet it by taking a beat, going back to the individual statements and seeing if maybe they could do it on their own and you don't really need to put them together. Well, when you do that, the statement you tend to want to look at more carefully is the complicated one. Like if one statement is more complicated than the other, that complicated statement is the one that's much more likely to be sufficient on its own. It's not a guarantee at all. I've seen the less complicated one be the sufficient one. I've seen the more complicated one get you like 90% of the way there, but need help from the less complicated one, leading to a genuine answer of C. But all of that is to say, if you're going to go back and vet the individual statements suspecting a C trap, take A more seriously, or rather take statement 1 more seriously than statement 2. We've got a time marker in statement 1 and a person mentioned, right? We kind of have the same in 2 as well. So there's something to that, but let's figure out what we can. As of 2:20 p.m. that afternoon, Cassie had yet to interact with Seth that day. Why should that be sufficient? Yeah, there is. There's an online resource. The GMAT people themselves put out such an online resource, but GMAT Club is an easy and really great, extensive resource for practice questions. The GMAT Club forums on problem solving, data insights, verbal, all that stuff. Endless questions there with lots of really good explanations for those questions as well. So plug for GMAT Club. They'll take care of you. So why is statement 1 sufficient? As of 2:20 p.m. that afternoon, Cassie had yet to interact with Seth that day. Okay, so what does that tell us? 2:20 p.m. rolls around and the meeting with Seth has not yet started. Now, could the meeting with Seth start at like 2:30 or something like that? And maybe we'd have time to meet with Fatima after that? Maybe. But could it really? This is where, if you want to be doing your due diligence here, if you're like, C seems a little bit too easy to me because that's like a lot of information. Of course, you can tell where Fatima went. Like Seth would have had to go kind of last, I guess. Natasha would have to go first-ish, something like that. Put them both together, it's enough. If you want to vet the statements individually, suspecting a trap, what you really need to do is come back to statement 1 and to statement 2 and show that they are insufficient. Show that they could lead to 2 different answers. So what are the possibilities for statement 1? Well, if at 2:20 p.m. Cassie had yet to interact with Seth for the day, you can kind of write out the time slots like this. You know, you're going to have 3 meetings. You know, you're going to have 15-minute intervals between them. And you know something about the timing of those 3 meetings as a result, right? One starts at 1 because there's only time for breaks between the meetings, not at the beginning, as Sai very correctly pointed out as a possible caveat to this. So the first meeting goes from 1 to 2, 15-minute break. Next meeting goes from 2:15 to 3:15, 15-minute break. The next meeting goes from 3:30 to 4:30. That we can know from the question stem alone. It may not seem like a great idea to draw that out from the question stem because who knows if you're ever going to use it. What I will say in general to that is draw it out. If you're dealing with a logic type question, really of any kind, taking down notes or diagramming things is the thing to do. That is, I would say, particularly true in these new, very logic based data sufficiency questions, or what they call non-math related data sufficiency questions. All right. Drawing this out, you know, having spaces in which you can put things, having maybe like an order in which you can place things if it happens to be an ordering question, having a place where you can match things up if it happens to be a matching question. These are the sorts of things that they're going to ask you to do in these logic-based data sufficiency questions: ordering, matching, and stuff like that. All right, this is an ordering one. Get these times and these time slots out. And when we look at statement 1 and we find out as of 2:20 p.m. this afternoon, so right 5 minutes into the second meeting, Cassie had yet to interact with Seth that day. Now, what does that then tell you? So she hasn't interacted with Seth by this point. That means she couldn't have met with Seth here. And she can't be meeting with Seth as of 2:15 because then she would have interacted with Seth by 2:20, presumably, or that's the most awkward 5 minutes of a meeting ever. And so Seth is going to have to go over here in the last slot. Now that still leaves open. Did Fatima go first and Natasha second? Or did Natasha go first and Fatima second? So there still seems to be some uncertainty here. But it doesn't matter. Why doesn't it matter? So again, we know from this statement, if you've kind of diagrammed it out and see the significance of 2:20 p.m., and that's really the trick here, we know that Seth goes last. Why doesn't it matter if we know whether Fatima goes first or second? Because again, this statement is sufficient. Now it's going to come through in chat window. In the meantime, I'm diagramming it out. Fair. So we got the meeting from 1 to 2, the meeting from 2:15 to 3:15, and then the meeting from 3:30. And we know, basically, per this information, Seth has to go here, and that is exactly right. Sai has got it. So we know Seth goes in the last meeting slot. We don't know if the first meeting is Fatima and the second one Natasha, or if the first one is Natasha and the second one Fatima. But we always have to bring it back to the question. This is a yes-no question, which means you can often get sufficiency with less information than you'd need for a value question. Like if the question had instead asked, at what time did Cassie meet with Fatima? Then the answer here is going to be C. Then you need both statements for sure, because that's asking for more of a pinpointed value. This thing's just asking, did Cassie meet with Fatima last? And the fact is, whether it's this scenario, the answer to the question is going to be no. Or this scenario, again, the answer to the question is going to be no. In neither case did Cassie meet with Fatima last, because whether Fatima's first or second, she is not last. That right there is a consistent answer. And a consistent answer in a yes-no question is a sufficient answer. You judge sufficiency and data sufficiency by whether the statement, 1, 2, both combined, returns a single answer to the question above. It doesn't have to return just a single like value or set of data. This one returned 2 possibilities, but both possibilities gave the same answer to the question up above, which means we know the answer to the question. Did Cassie meet with Fatima last? No, according to the information in statement 1. Definitive no. That makes statement 1 sufficient. And it means that AD will stick around while B, C, and E will be eliminated. At this point, either statement 1 is sufficient, statement 2 is not, that's A, or statement 1 is sufficient and statement 2 is also sufficient independently of that. That would be D. But when we get to statement 2, Cassie met with Natasha first that afternoon. It doesn't work out so well. Why not? We've got our 3 slots. That's our 1 o'clock, that's our 2:15, and that's our 3:30. And if we know that Natasha went first that afternoon, that's fixed. Well then, we still have 2 cases for the other 2 people. It could be that Fatima goes and Seth goes, in which case our answer to the question, does Cassie meet with Fatima last, would be no, yet again. But it could be that Natasha goes first, Seth goes second, and Fatima goes third, in which case the question, did Cassie meet with Fatima last, would have a yes answer. And that right there is insufficient for a yes-no question. If the information provided by a statement leaves you thinking, well, it might be yes, but it might be no, you're no better off than when you started. You already knew that the answer might be yes or might be no, right? So statement 2, not doing it on its own, and the answer here ends up being A. Notice though, if you picked C on this one especially, notice that part of the trick in data sufficiency, and this has always been the case, is that they hope that you don't put in all the work to vet the statements that sometimes they really require. Statement 1 takes some actual work, some diagramming out to vet. Even the question itself and the information given up there benefits from a little bit of diagramming so you can have a framework, right? If you skip that work, you're walking into their traps a lot of the time. All right. And so you can maybe initially in a problem skip that work. But again, if you start feeling like you're getting trapped, especially if you're getting an answer of C without doing much work, that's the time to say, okay, you know what? No way, not for me. I'm not trap bait. I'm going to go back and do some more serious work in at least the more complicated statement and see what I can do. And you see what that work entails. Now, I said you have to prove it insufficient to feel really good about it. Proving insufficient means showing that you can, using the information, get 2 different answers to the question. When you try to do that with A, it turns out no dice. You get the same answer to the question. That's why it's sufficient. B, statement 2, not so much. Okay? Well done, those of you who picked A, and indeed, as Pooja says, C is very much a trap choice. All right. That's the new kind of data sufficiency you can be getting. Now, I got very few of these on my real exam, but that's going to come down to luck of the draw. I also got in quant a ton of rate questions on my exam, whereas one of my colleagues took the exam shortly after and got 1 rate question. I got like 4 or 5 rate questions. So like each exam is different, right? They're pulling from a big pool of questions and you don't know exactly what kinds of questions they're going to give you. A lot of your data sufficiency questions could be kind of like this. So if you're enjoying it, if you're like, well, I'd rather have this than math, cool. Then hopefully you get a lot of these. but it could be that a lot of them are mathy as mine were. And you got to be ready then for anything. The old GMAT materials, the old GMAT official guides and their data sufficiency will will prepare you for the mathy data sufficiency questions, but to prepare for the more logic-based ones, you'd want to get some of the newer GMAT materials. Their online resources for the Focus Edition or their official guide for the Focus Edition. Oh, these are great questions. Like Vidit is asking a good question, and I know it's for Sai, but I'll answer it anyway. In a perfect world, you would answer the question to the best of your ability when you first see it, because indeed the test is adaptive, and even if you come back and change your answer to something later, it can still kind of affect things. But I will say, for my part, I started falling asleep during one of the questions in the verbal section, genuinely started dozing off. And try as I might, I'd like revive myself, I'd sit up straight, I'd like move my leg a little bit, but I just could not get through all the answer choices without dozing off again. It felt like a horrible trap. And so on that verbal question, I just had to leave it behind. I had to like put in a random answer for it because I was like, I need to get out of this horrible loop. Put in a random answer, left it behind. And it was kind of late in the section. I think it was, I can find out because I do have it open in the background, but it was fairly late in the section, this question. So it might not have changed much about the trajectory of the whole thing. However, I ended up with each of the sections is scored on a scale of 90. I ended up with an 89 in verbal, not because I did that. I did go back to that question. I changed it from the wrong kind of placeholder answer I'd put in to a correct answer. It was from C to E in that particular case. But I had missed the question just before it, which I would have done well to check too, because if I was dozing off on that question, I probably wasn't at my best on the question before it either. I'd missed the question just before it. And that means that that question, that single question I'd missed before it, was obviously responsible for my like 1 point off, presumably at least, out of my like full scaled score of 90, right? The 89 was because of the question I missed. But that also kind of implies that the question that I initially missed but came back to and fixed didn't cost me much in the way of score, right? Like it didn't add to my lower score. I got 1 point off. I missed one question. It's fair to assume that one question cost me that 1 point essentially. So it may not be that big a deal. I would imagine that the earlier you leave a question and come back to it, the more of a difference that could end up making. But still, it's not like a guaranteed thing that if you do it that way, you're going to be in trouble. Yeah, it was question like 19 on my verbal section, 19 out of 23 that I just got stuck on and spent 8.4 minutes on. So that's nice. Is it better to focus on 15, 16 questions rather than 20 and try to get those right only? Yeah, like basically, if you know that trying to do all 20 is not going to work for you, it's at least worth trying that strategy in a practice test to see if it pans out for you. For a lot of people, it would be more prudent to do it that way. And maybe in a perfect world, you'd be trying more like 17 or even 18 and just burning 2 pretty quickly. Hopefully with like practice, you can get there. At least that's not bad at all. But yeah, even if you're investing in 15, 16, like you kind of have to play the hand you're dealt, right? And so if you know you're having trouble finishing the data insights section, if you know that you're a few questions behind when you finish, or that you're like rushing and missing a whole bunch of the later questions because you're trying to rush through all of them, it is definitely better to not do that. Commit to like 15, 16, and ideally try not to get too many wrong in a row as well. Like if you're going to do the 15, 16 questions thing, you're probably skipping a couple of questions along the way when particularly time consuming or challenging questions for you come up. Yeah, there's a bit of a penalty for not solving such questions. Sai, this is a fairly difficult question. I don't know if it's like a full on hard question, but it's above the 50th percentile, I would say, for difficulty. Right. Yeah, there's a penalty for not solving some questions in the sense, Omkar, that if you don't finish the section, you get the questions you don't get to wrong, and you get a penalty for not finishing the section. And they say that like really clearly at the beginning of the test or at the beginning of the sections now. I remember being like particularly informed about that like feature of the test this time when I was taking it more than ever before. So yeah, there's a penalty. And actually I incurred that penalty on the data insights section, as I will show you toward the end. So yeah, try to finish the section, even if you just have to guess out the kind of ending questions. All right, these are great questions. Now, that's data sufficiency. And again, I really wanted to emphasize this is what's new in data sufficiency. But for anybody who was not super familiar with the IR section, or for anybody who was familiar with it but hadn't necessarily broken it down into like different types and subtypes. So you'll know that there are these 4 question types, or 4 prompt types at least. There are table prompts, there are the MSR prompts, multi-source reasoning, in which you get 2 or 3 tabs of information. Mine is such a blur now that I do not remember how many tabs I got, but I think it was 2 tabs. I think I was like pleasantly surprised on my Focus Edition. You're gonna have some graphs questions and you're gonna have some 2-part questions, but more specifically, 2 parts you generally have about 4 of, generally. And of those 4, about half are generally math related and half are generally verbal or logic related. It's hard to kind of like piece together what you got from the way they lay out this thing, but I got at least one non-math related 2-part analysis question toward the end of my section. Another non-math related 2-part analysis question is number 14, and so on. So they're definitely not all going to be math related, but usually about 2 of them will be. I'm trying to check if that's what I got. Non-math, yeah. I got 2 math related and 2 non-math related 2-part analysis questions. So that's kind of what one would expect out of a typical IR section. And really not much has changed about the typical IR components that show up in data insights. So you'd expect 2 quant ones, and these are usually like classic word problems, algebraic translation stuff, statistic stuff, rates and work, rates and distance, percents, fractions, all sorts of things like that. The 2-part quant questions are exactly what you'd expect in normal quant problem-solving problems. The only difference is you've got to answer 2 questions at the end, like what's the value of x and y, instead of just what's the value of x. Usually then one will be on the verbal side, so kind of a critical reasoning or even reading comprehension style question. And one will be on the logic side, and those 2 together would be the 2 non-math 2-part analysis questions. All right. Graphics interpretation questions are going to vary between math and logic. You'll have usually 1 to 2 math ones, and you'll typically know them because the math graph questions come with easier looking graphs. All right, the easier looking the graph is, the easier it is to look at the graph and like kind of immediately interpret the information on it, the more likely it is you're going to be getting a mathematically challenging question down below. All right. And then you'll have usually like 1 kind of logic type question. Could be 0, but it's nowadays, I think, more likely to be 1. And then 1 kind of weird looking graph. And that can be a graph that's like particularly busy, like a lot of different kinds of information all on the same graph. It can be a graph that presents information in a way that you just haven't seen before. For instance, I once saw in some test forever ago, like family tree represented as concentric circles for some reason. Not the normal way to illustrate a family tree, but that's the way they wanted to do it, so that they could see if you could figure out what the graph was showing from the kind of paragraph they wrote about it, along with clues in the graph itself. So those are the graph types. The hardest question I can remember from my data insights section was a graph question. And it was a very like weird looking / logic based graph. It was kind of a scatter plot, but there were, I think, about 5 different kinds of dots, for lack of a better word, on the scatter plot. They were really like little icons of things, right? So like 5 different kinds of things shown on this scatter plot. And then the question they were asking on it was a percent question, but it was a fairly difficult percent question. And they called that one math related because of the percent nature of it, but I can tell you from my perspective, it was about the most logic driven percent question I've ever seen. Because you didn't have to do a lot of calculations, you had to get the logic of what the question they were asking was about. That is the question I spent the longest on in my data insights section, and that one was, you can actually see it here real quick, 6.8 minutes. This is my data insights section, you guys, so you can see. You're looking to average a little over 2 minutes. I was almost there, but you can see here, I did not get to answer this question. I was running out of time. I got to it. I put in an answer. I clicked confirm. They give you a pop-up in the middle of the screen. And before I could get to that pop-up and say yes, or really want to confirm, ran out of time. And so they didn't count it. And I incurred that penalty. All right. That ended up driving my data insights score along with the 2 that I missed. This 2-part analysis where I was basically running out of time. I had to cut that one short very quickly, as you can see, under a minute, to try to get an answer in for this one so I wouldn't get the penalty. Left it too late. But the one I really missed was this non-math related data sufficiency question early on. And maybe I thought I'd have time to go back to it. Didn't have time to go back to it because data insights is really hard to finish on its own. But these 2 questions, notice how much they killed me, right? I was doing okay on time until these later ones. These later ones were very hard. This is one of the hardest questions I've ever seen in graphs especially. And so that sort of thing can happen. It wasn't particularly mathy, but it was a very, very busy and hard graph to figure out. Looking at the questions, there's not so much a different weightage for graph or MSR or DS or table or 2-part questions. As I think has long been the case with the GMAT, the different weight is more down to the difficulty of the questions themselves. The harder the question is, the less it hurts you to get it wrong. The easier the question is, the more it hurts you to get it wrong, right? So this question, for instance, getting it wrong that early on, there's a good chance it cost me more than getting this much later question wrong, because I was on such a win streak then that this was probably a fairly hard question, especially judging by the difficulty of these 2 questions here. I was getting into some fairly hard territory. So it didn't really matter that this was like a 2-part analysis question that I got wrong. It was definitely just more important that they considered it a hard question. Same happened on my verbal. The one I got wrong was fairly late in the game, and it's a big part of the reason I think it only cost me 1 point off the top verbal score instead of more. Right. Let's see. A reliable link to where these resources are available. I think there's going to be a link to this YouTube video if nothing else. This is my like actual test result from MBA.com, so that one's not going to be available to you. One interesting thing worth pointing out is, even though I missed a data sufficiency question, they still gave me 100th percentile performance. And even though this too was a data sufficiency question, I don't know if their percentiles are off or what the heck. It may well be, given this percentile ranking on the 1 2-part analysis question I missed, that this one actually cost me the most because it happened to be easy, and these ones cost me nearly nothing because they happen to be hard. They're kind of cagey about how the algorithm works, and they haven't given us a huge amount of information yet. We're going to find out more about it as we go. But the classic GMAT way of dealing with things is, the harder the question you get wrong, the less it hurts your score. Right? So that's what you expect in graphs. Table questions can be either math or logic. You usually get about 2 of them, and usually 1 is more mathy or findy, and 1 is more of a logic question, again with like ordering or ranking or things like that to do. And then MSR. MSR is like the reading comprehension of the IR section. You get 3 questions bundled with your MSR prompt, and you basically just try your best on that, regardless of what it is. Some of them are more verbal, some of them are more quantitative, some of them are more logic-based. I've seen all 3 types. Pretty sure I got a fairly logic-based one on my exam, but It's just no clear memory of the MSR. It was fairly early on in the section, and then once I got later, yeah, I was quite consumed with other stuff. Looking at the questions now, it's saying that like a couple of the MSR questions were math related for me, but one definitely wasn't. So some logic and some math going on there in all likelihood. Not logical reasoning in the sense of like critical reasoning, strength and weaken. The only time, Pooja, that might come up is in your two-part verbal question. There you might have some like strength and weaken, but logical reasoning in the sense of like what we just saw with the Natasha Fatima Seth question, that kind of logical reasoning, yeah, logic of that sort. But yeah, not what like the GRE or would call logical reasoning or the LSAT would call logical reasoning. That's mostly in the verbal section with maybe like one in data insights. Um, to answer that question, it's a great question. How do you bring down your time in data insights? Yes, answering more questions will help. The best thing you can do right now is know which questions are taking you the longest time, because if you could like maybe burn two of those questions that are taking you the longest time, but use that time to get to like three or four of those remaining five questions, that might well be worth it. Like strategizing differently is one of the responses to that. Practice is definitely one of the responses to that, and especially practice in types that are taking you too long. But all of that kind of requires you to know what those types are, essentially. So that too comes from practice, meaning practice one way or another is your antidote. Pay attention for what types of questions are long for you so you know which ones to consider skipping on test day. And hopefully the practice itself will make your time come down so that at least you're getting reliably through like 17 or 18 questions. And then you can still afford to skip some, just know which ones they are. Yeah. I can't show the actual question, which took me that long because it was a real exam. Like they don't release those questions, and they would not want me, sharing the details. They are very clear on how bad it is if you share the details. So I don't have access to it and I can't show it, but I will just say it was like there were maybe 40 points on this scatter plot of like five different varieties, and the axes showed percentages as decimals, and the question then asked for something kind of not shown on there, but something that could be, reasoned by what was shown on there, and so it was a lot. Omka, the best resource is any official resource. There is a data insights forum at GMAT Club now, in which you can find official questions from the GMAT people. So that would be a good thing. But like any sort of like 2023, 2024 official guide will have data insights practice from the actual GMAT makers. Their official practice tests will have them. And their online resources, some of their online question banks from GMAT will have those things. Those are the best place to start. Private companies also make data insights questions. I actually myself wrote a few of our data sufficiency questions for this new logic type. But those are still, in a certain sense, imitation questions, and the genuine article is the best to practice with, at least when you're first getting to know the question types. And so either get a GMAT official guide or get some of their online resources, or go to GMAT Club's Data Insights Forum and practice there. But there again, choose sources that are official if you at all. These are great questions. As always, the questions are my favorite part. Yes. All right, let me show you a couple of these IR types so you can get a sense of how they actually play out. And we'll just go kind of in clockwise order. So I'll show you a table real quick, a graph real quick. A table real quick, multi-source reasoning, two-part, and then end on a graph question. And we're not really going to commit to doing these, but I want you to get a sense of what these look like and how they play out. Table questions are, in a sense, always like this. Now, this is a fairly small, no, this is about an average size table. The information shown is fairly straightforward on the table, but when I say that tables are basically like this, I mean, they're going to give you a table, they're going to give you a little blurb here, and they're going to give you three statements that you have to decide either yes or true. They are true based on information in the table, or no or false, they sometimes call it, which is basically doing double duty. Either the statement is contradicted by the table, or the table just doesn't contain enough information to say one way or the other. That is to say, there's insufficient data in the table to justify the statement. What's not shown here, but what will be here is basically like right here, there will be a drop down whereby you can sort this table by column. Hard to do in PowerPoint, it turns out, but really easy to do on the test. That's how it's going to be. The table will always be sorted by the leftmost column in like alphabetical order, but you can then sort by production world share instead, production world rank, exports world share, exports world rank. And that's helpful because like, look at the second statement here. It starts, if Brazil produces more than 20% of the world's supply of a commodity. You pause there, sort by production world share, and you'll get all your ones over 20% next to each other at the bottom right there in order. That's just a good way to like look at the data more easily and carefully, right? It's good functionality and you want it for some of the questions for sure. One thing that you really have to be careful about, and this is true in all of data insights, but it's particularly true in table questions, I find. Be careful about your reading. They very deliberately give these columns similar names. So production, but also world share with world share, world rank with world rank. And I do this particular question a lot because it's part of the executive assessment courses we run, where IR is also a thing. And I can say that basically a lot of people get this third statement wrong, and it's entirely because they look in the wrong column. All right, this one says of the commodities in the table for which Brazil ranks first in world exports. So that's like these three. This one here, and that one there, right? Ranks first in world exports. And again, there, make sure you're looking at the right ranking column. It's exports, not production world rank. So it says of those commodities, and again, you could sort by this, they'd all be together. Brazil produces more than 20% of the world's supply. What people do is say 20%. Well, let me look at these percents. These are all over 20. This is all over 20. That's over 20. So this is definitely a yes. But the problem there is that the keyword was produces. All right. And so it's not this stuff that we want to be worried about at all. Nope. It's the production world share, where we can see actually that no, they're not all over 20%. And this one would be a no as a result. Okay. They deliberately give you similar information in the columns, similar names to the columns, because one of the biggest things they're hoping you do is just look in the wrong place, and they do it deliberately. Like there's a reason this one starts you on world exports, the like exports world rank, the rightmost column, and then asks you to cross-reference it with the column that's furthest away. And it's that they know that people are going to be automatically inclined to cross-reference it with this column, and boom, you've played right into their hands. You'll live to regret it. So those are table questions. MSR questions look like this. You'll notice that format-wise, they're just like table questions, 3 statements, and you decide yes or no, true or false, or things like that. But in truth, what's actually going on in MSR is you've got 3 standalone problems. 3 of your 20 data insights questions will be tied to this 3 tabs of information in this particular case: techniques, artifacts, budget. So this will be just one of the problems. Now, per IR rules, you have to get all 3 of these calls correct to get credit for this problem, but you don't have to get this problem correct to get credit for like the next problem or something like that. Also, just know this for MSR, to answer basically every MSR question, you're going to have to use information from like at least 2 of the tabs. Using information from 2 of the tabs is the norm for answering MSR questions. All right. So know that. And let's see. This, by the way, is an example of the other kind of question that can be tied to MSR. You're going to get like 1 like this, 2 like the one we just saw. This is a classic multiple choice. Just choose 1 of the 5. The other 2 are like those yes, no, true, false, either or type questions. And those you have to get all the calls for, right? So 3 questions individually tied to MSR in much the same way that like 3 questions will be tied to a lot of your reading comprehension passages. Next up, 2-part questions. 2-part questions go kind of like this. And this is a very kind of verbal or logic-based question. The line between verbal and logic-based questions is pretty thin. but it's more a logic-based question than a verbal question. All right. They give you new information up here, a fictitious type of location called a Marefa. Then they give you information about this new thing, right? Like kind of rules on how it works. And then they ask you to make some calls down here. Take notes on those rules so that you have shorter versions of it, and you should be able to do pretty well down here. You can also kind of play this as though it's a reading comprehension question, because it is. They're asking what must happen in the location, what must not happen in the location. That information has to come from up here somewhere. You just have to find it. All right. So this is more non-math related, as they call it. Two-part question. Math related ones, again, are nothing new. Stuff you'd expect from the quant section. And finally, graph questions. As I said, graph questions can come in a pretty big variety, but the more normal looking the graph is, and I would say this is a pretty normal looking graph, like pretty easy to read this graph in 10, 20 seconds. You're getting masses on the y-axis shown by this graph, ages on the x-axis, and it's Tyrannosaurus Rex. Awesome, like done. A, B, and C are the only kind of unknowns from this graph. And they'll tell you that over there because like table questions, graph questions come usually with a bit of a paragraph explaining them. In fact, the more difficult or abstruse the graph itself is, the more weird looking it is or logic based it is, the bigger that blurb will be. And the same is true for table questions. The more logic based the table question, the more information they're going to give you in that paragraph, and it'll be key information. Read the key information there one sentence at a time, map it to the graph. One thing, map it. One thing, map it to the graph, right? Now, the thing again to highlight here is because this is an easy looking graph, these questions are mathematical and a bit mathematically intense. All right. These will be drop downs on the real test. So you'll see these answer choices when you click them and see the drop downs. But this involves a lot of work. You do have a calculator at your disposal in the data insights section, and that is the one, I think, saving grace of the data insights section. But given that there are so many logic questions, it's not going to help you there anyway. You probably end up using the calculator in about 3 maybe of the questions, 2 of the questions productively. Often a table question will benefit from a calculator use, and at least one of the graph questions will. This one might well. In fact, specifically this second question down here really does benefit from calculator use. You do not have a calculator on the quant section, so don't get used to it when you're studying quant, but in data insights, you do. Right. And for anybody wondering, it's C and A. Again, genuinely a very hard question. Don't be fooled by the innocent looking graph, okay? One last question looks like there. In MSR, do I suggest you read the info first or read the question stem and then fall back to the passage? Both. I honestly, the way I do it is I read the first tab, then I look to the question stem and see where I'm at. And, you know, whatever I don't recognize in terms of keywords in the question, then I'll go back and read the next tab or the other tabs and pay attention for that keyword just to keep me engaged a little bit. So I'll break it up, read one tab, then the question, then the other tab or the other tabs. Okay, you guys, we are about out of time, but no, you can get free resources, free practice tests, for instance, at manhattanprep.com. Go there. And for anybody thinking about taking a course, discounts available. Enjoy it. Sign up. You guys, thank you everybody for coming out today. Thank you for all your questions. I really appreciate it. I hope that I was helpful to you. This link will be posted on YouTube and yeah, and in GMAT Club somewhere, I think. And best of luck to you in all your studies.